Greetings and salutations, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. Unless you're new, then welcome for the first time in general. So I decided to mix things up a little bit with this one and check out a documentary. Two, actually. VHS Massacre from 2016 and the follow-up VHS Massacre 2 from 2020. These are from directors Thomas Edward Seymour and Kenneth Powell. I believe they're distributed by Troma Films as well. So let's start out with the initial documentary, VHS Massacre from 2016. So I'm a subscriber to Night Flight, and I received, I'll go into a little bit more about Night Flight later, but I received an email stating that they had recently made available VHS Massacre, which is a documentary kind of exploring like the rise and fall of VHS and the effects it's had on the independent and cult film industry and physical media in general, and where that's going, what the future holds for physical media. So this one's clocking in at a mere 72 minutes, I believe. But that time is really well spent. So they basically took me on a trip kind of like through my childhood in a way, as they explored the history of VHS, its effects on the film industry, this boom of home video rentals from the late 70s through the 90s. But more importantly to me were like those strange titles that they talked about and people collecting a lot of those. So, those independent films, many of which never got a wide theatrical release, if they had a theatrical release at all. Those cult films as well, which were kind of like the main differences between the libraries of films carried from the small local mom and pop video stores versus the big box ones like Blockbuster Video or Hollywood Video. So the focus of this first documentary is mainly VHS, independent films, kind of how that kind of helped out that industry, VHS in general. And while they don't go into the level of detail on the titles that they do in the recent horror documentary that I reviewed, In Search of Darkness, Volumes 1, 2, and 3, which I have a video on and I'll link to at the end of this video and in the description as well. That's not really the point, the details on all these films. The titles are various, from those cult films to even some of the more popular ones that are flooding the shelves at, those big corporate rental houses. But what this one really brought to mind were the memories of what I call the 666, the 6 movies for 6 days for $6 that the mom and pop locations would use those sales to try to compete with and stay away from being kind of gobbled up by the likes of the big ones like Blockbuster and Hollywood. Now, I love movies in general, as you can see with some of my previous videos being all over the place. I mean, I got a video for Everything Everywhere All at Once, big Oscar winner there, Val, The Legend of Billie Jean, 80s comedies, 80s horror, a lot of new horror stuff, basically for like just certain streaming services like Shudder, and over 40 Hammer films that I've gone through. So for me, back in the day, I was pretty much fine with Blockbuster and Hollywood Video, not in their business practices, of course, but I could go there for some things. I knew that the newest films they would have 100 copies of. But I always had to hit up those mom and pop ones for many of the titles that they mentioned in this documentary. I mean, speaking again about Everything Everywhere All at Once, I knew about Michelle Yeoh from Heroic Trio and Police Story 3, also known as Super Cop. Mom and pop is what gave me that. They didn't carry any of that at Blockbuster or Hollywood Video. I had to go to this little small hole in the wall. Same thing with anything from Troma, whether it's Surf Nazis Must Die or Class of Nukem High or even, Toxic Avenger, their big one. You would never see that at places like Blockbuster. So, and I even checked out Faces of Death back in the day. I had this morbid curiosity that I got some hole in the wall VHS rental place. I mean, it also rented DVDs at a time back in the late 90s when I was living in Studio City, when a friend of mine wanted to check it out. But anyways, this documentary really covers in great detail how important VHS and, via mom and pop, especially, those little rental stores were to the independent cult film industry. And it was a really amazing trip down memory lane, not just in like the locations that they mentioned and the titles and industry information, but through various interviews with, film scholars and everything, and the likes of like Joe Bob Briggs and Lloyd Kaufman and Greg Sestero, and just too many to even mention. But then when it was all finished, at that end credits, I went to check in this title on my Letterboxd and saw there was another one. There's a follow-up, VHS Massacre 2, TOO, which came out a few years later in 2020, I believe. It dives deeper, not so much into the physical media and VHS as much as into the exploitation and independent films in general. So while it does touch on that VHS portion a bit, and the physical media stuff a bit, it goes further into detail as to where independent and exploitation films are today, or 2020 when they made this one. It really was a great follow-up, as there are some There are some reused shots in it, which admittedly I wouldn't have noticed if I had seen the first one years earlier when it came out, but I'd literally seen it the night before, so I recognized a lot of those shots. But we also get some additional portions of interviews that they filmed for the initial film that they're kind of now expanding out into this one. So it's almost like seeing just this extension of certain interviews that they carried out. But it really doesn't reuse many of the same topics, and it instead focuses on the history of this exploitation in independent films. They mention films like Cannibal Holocaust, Shaft, Coffee, I Spit on Your Grave, so many others that they mention. Now, I've only seen a few of those titles, but I've heard of many of the ones that they mentioned, either by seeing them in the stores back in the day or seeing a lot of parodies carried out over the past 10 or 20 years. Now, it goes very deep into independent filmmaking and how it has had to change with the times, especially without having that same avenue for rentals, for physical media rentals such as VHS, to earn any of that money back. For their investors, and also how predatory some of these distribution companies have become, and how messy it can be to get a film online for streaming at all, much less stay there and actually earn money. So it was kind of sad at times having the expectations and assumptions that I had that these days with social media and digital availability that it would be easier to get a film out, get notice, and earn that investment back, when in fact without the availability of VHS and just physical media in general, doing those physical rentals, how the industry was run in the 80s and 90s, much less brick and mortar rental houses just being gone these days, it's actually made some aspects of filmmaking much more difficult to pull off. So luckily though, it's not an all-out downer. There are aspects of it that are a bit inspirational. Seeing these filmmakers putting their, hearing about how they put their hearts into all these projects. And there is one moment that really stood out to me. Using part like an extension from their earlier interview in 2014, 2015 with Joe Bob Briggs, which weren't used in the initial film. He was asked if he could ever see being on TV again, hosting another show like Monster Vision. He shot it down. He said, in this atmosphere, everything's changed. There's no home for hosts like him or any of that kind of content. Keep in mind, like I said, this was for the first film, so it's probably filmed in 2014 or 2015. But they even showed a little follow-up that a couple of years later, right before they released this VHS Massacre 2, he got to do his first special on Shudder. And that was one of the reasons why I'd actually renewed my subscription to Shudder, was his special, which crashed Shudder. That's how popular it was. I had to actually watch it on a replay. And now, which I believe it's April 7th, I'm excited for season 5 is going to be coming for The Last Drive-In just a few weeks. But anyways, back to more about this title in particular. Through those downers we hear about regarding the difficulties of basically creating a new avenue for these kinds of films, situations like his kind of give hope that anything is possible. Even this more in-depth kind of interviews that they've had with Lloyd Kaufman of Troma, he seems to have these glimmers of possibilities of some steps that can be taken to hopefully kind of renew this kind of industry, so independent films and exploitation films can have another way to get out there. But all in all, this these two films made me want to do a few things. One was I wanted to revisit some of those strange old titles from my childhood. I haven't seen any of those Troma films in years, and there are a lot of them that I never got to see in the first place. So I really want to also get around to a lot of those ones that I never got to see, as Blockbuster and Hollywood were pushing all those stores out of business, and I didn't have a chance to rent those back in the day, and they're harder to find now. It also makes me want to buy more physical media. You'll be able to buy Avengers Endgame forever probably, and you'll be able to stream it probably forever. But there are those other titles that are harder to come by that are really worth actually buying and collecting. Vote with your dollars and where you're going to spend those dollars. And I also want to continue my subscription for Night Flight, as well as renew my subscription for Full Moon, because there's take a shift away from a lot of these new films, which are great. They're amazing. I love a lot of them. I love a lot of different kinds of movies, but I want to check out more of those strange independent films of the past, build up more of a physical media collection, really get back into that. So quick note, you should really check out these documentaries. I feel they're both available also on Tubi, which so far I've watched about 6 or 8 films on there over the past few months, and it's pretty decent. It is ad-based, but they're not overboard with it. They're not as lengthy of an ad or as repetitive as you see on some other ad-based services. And services like Full Moon and Night Flight, they not just have some really interesting titles that you may not find on any other services, but they usually have some pretty great annual deals set up as well. So Anyways, thanks for sticking around for, to the end of this video. It really helps out the channel out quite a bit, as does subscribing and hitting that little bell icon to get notifications when I put up new content, which, like I usually say, is 1 to 3 times a week, depends on what I have to talk about. So anyway, sound off in the comments. What are your some of your favorite streaming services, places that you like to buy physical media, as well as some of those old strange films that perhaps your younger years, that you really enjoyed from your younger years, and just sound off. Let us know what your kind of history is, and get some conversation going, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks for stopping by.